few thoughts today, sermon titled Peto's Paradox. Did anybody perhaps Google that to find out what the paradox is about? I'm just trying to determine how much background I should provide to make sense of the title. You did?
No, I thought of Pareto's principle. I was wondering whose version of that.
No, it's not Pareto's principle. Peto's paradox comes to us from the world of cancer research, a very interesting branch of research, and it was coined in honor of the work of a British researcher, Richard Peto, who in the previous century, second half of it, did most of his work on tumors in mice, the formation of tumors in mice, and trying to determine from that research how we could perhaps draw conclusions or project what would apply to cancer formation, the formation of cancer cells or cancerous cells in humans. And he concluded that time plays a role. The lifespan of an organism plays a role in the formation of cancerous cells because, and I'm out of my depth totally here, but the little bit I understand is when cells divide and they mutate, and the genome becomes unstable in the process. That is when cancer sets in. And if enough of those mutated cells starts replicating, then you get a tumor in humans. Later on, Peto also added to the lifespan and the opportunity for cells to mutate as they divide. He added the number of cells in an organism to it as well, so that big organisms, large-bodied organisms like whales and elephants and sharks, he says that also should play a role in the formation of tumors, because the more cells there are, the more opportunity for mutations to happen as this animal grows. The interesting thing that he found is that compared to humans, elephants and also sharks, he didn't do it on sharks, but people that took his research found that in elephants especially, the principle doesn't apply. Peto's paradox doesn't apply. Elephants live very long, and they are significantly bigger, larger animals than we are. But animals don't get cancer. I think the percentage is something like 5% or 4% compared to 15 to 25% of incidence in human populations. But elephants don't get cancer that often. And research initially done in Chicago seems to indicate, I think research done in 2015, so it's all preliminary at this stage, seem to indicate that elephants have a specific gene. I think it's called T53. That specific gene has the ability to identify mutating cells that can be harmful and zooms in on them and releases a protein that has the effect of setting in motion the process of killing the cell. So it's actually a sniper gene or a SWAT team gene sitting around looking for harmful elements, mutating genes, and then cells, and then getting in and to start to let the cell die, take out the harmful cell. The same initial research is found in sharks, that because they've been around for so long, 16 million years, their genome sequences are very stable. So there's less mutation that takes place as this massive animal that grows up to a size, the great white, of 3 tons, for those genes to, or for those cells to mutate and to develop harmful genome sequences. I found it fascinating, although in my mining of the research and this link leading to that one, I soon arrived at a point where I didn't have any idea what these wonderful papers were talking about. So perhaps some of our medical doctors or other researchers can enlighten me at some stage. And you may have a valid question at this thing, so what does that have to do with us in a service here? And what does that have to do with Jeremiah, who wrote this letter to the people in exile in Babylon in the 6th century BC, after they were taken captive, and the elite, the cream of the crop, the elites of the Judean or the Israel population taken to Babylon, the capital of civilization at that stage. And the answer is fairly simple, although it addresses something in my mind of almost surreal complexity and difficulty. It has to do with how to live, hopefully, in a sea of despair. Because this letter that Jeremiah wrote to the exiles in Babylon is a letter that addresses them as people who have been uprooted, taken from God's city, from Jerusalem, with a temple that was destroyed and put in Babylon, while many of the, or much of the, many of the population remained in this destroyed city without protection. They were taken to Babylon, the elites, to be indoctrinated to become proper Babylonians, because that was how the Babylonian Empire worked. They would take the best of the population, the leadership corps, the upper crust, take them to their city, indoctrinate them, and then take them back to where they came from after a generation or so, after they've been made proper Babylonians. Then there won't be insurrection, there won't be a rebellion against the Babylonian Empire. But for an Israelite to be taken from God's city and put in this place was an existential crisis. Because they were away from the temple that was regarded as the dwelling place of God on earth. The connection of the Israel God with the covenanted people, the people of Israel. So in their moments of total despair, and you can read about this despair in a number of Old Testament books. Jeremiah, who has a long history of also not being very well regarded in Jerusalem, he writes them a letter. Jeremiah's ancestors had a severe difference with an Israelite king a few generations before he wrote this book. And they spoke truth to power, and his ancestors told the king, they were also priests in the temple, you should mend your ways, what you are doing is not God's way. And what was the response of the powerful king? He told him, you're fired, get out of here. You're no longer a priest, out of Jerusalem with you. So they settled in a small village where they could actually see Jerusalem, but they couldn't go there to practice their trade as priests. So Jeremiah, I think, enjoyed it to prophesy and say, God's going to punish you, Jerusalem, you the king, Trouble is waiting for you, and so the trouble arrived in the form of the Babylonian king that decimated them. So he's writing to them and say, you people in exile, don't despair. You people in exile, remember who you are. You are God's people. And God has not forgotten you, even though you are not in God's city anymore. Because God's love is not confined to a geographical region, as was the common belief about God and God's people in those days. And what does Jeremiah tell them? He says to them, live fully, remembering who you are, where you come from. Remember that you are God's covenanted people. And go and live in that city, that foreign city, the city of the oppressor that uprooted you. And they are making Babylonians of you. Be productive. Build houses. Plant fields. Plant fruit trees. Enjoy the harvest. And have children. And let your children have children. Because you will return. And be such productive people and be the people of God in the circumstances that you find yourself in, also for the benefit of that city that you find yourself in. Live a life-giving existence as God's people. That was, in short, the message of Jeremiah, a message of hope in spite of the reality of despair and of not seeing any light in the circumstances that they found themselves in. And again, a valid question at this stage, so what? What does it have to do with us today? In my reading about Peto's paradox, as I was getting excited about the possibilities of this research and the research that started with identifying those genes and then experimenting with the possibilities of introducing some of that into the human genome sequence, it suddenly dawned on me, the great white may not be around for much longer. The great white as an apex predator really experiencing difficulty to survive. Not only because of the huge appetite of the blossoming Chinese population and the middle class, especially for shark fin soup, where they kill millions of sharks, just cutting off the fins and dumping the bodies into the ocean so that the shark will drown, because the shark has to constantly swim so that the water can go through its gulls. Not only because of that, but because of just of the condition of our oceans. And climate change, as with most things these days, play a role there. And also elephants, if you look at the declining elephant population. So I had real difficulty while being excited about the possibility of research. I'm thinking we are on the verge of perhaps having the wisdom to go to nature and try and figure out what lessons can we glean from that. But at the same time, we are destroying the possibilities that could hold hope for the future and for the high number of people affected by the terrible disease of cancer. Because if you look at the scientific consensus and you read research and reports like the latest about insect extinction, and it varies. The biomass of insects, research in Germany initially indicated 75% of the biomass of insects have gone over the last 25 years. The same research was repeated in England, and it found 80% in England. Research done in the US, same, 80% gone of the biomass of insects. And the researchers say, just do your own test, drive at night. How many times do you have to clean your windshield these days? We don't do it anymore because there are no insects left to mess up our windshields. And then in Puerto Rico, the alarming situation that some entomologists encountered there was on the rainforest floor, 98% of ground-dwelling insects were gone. 98%. That is, and they said, if it continues at this pace, within 10 years, we will not have insects left on the planet. 10 years. So I thought, no, that can't be, and I decided I'll try my little spot, my 2 acres, to really be organic there and let the insects flourish. But it is alarming statistics brought to us by proper scientific research, not by alarmists. And it is shocking if you think, since 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, more CO2 have been pumped into our atmosphere by us knowing about climate change and global warming than in human existence preceding that. So in 2 decades, we have done the harm to our environment through CO2 emissions that has been done in all of the history of humanity since then. That is willful damage being done. So, and I can continue, and I don't want to be, in Afrikaans we have a saying, he's a real Jeremiah, because of the Jeremiah predicting catastrophe and complaining about this and about that. That's not the case. But I think we should be reality-based in our existence. So, what to do or what not to do? And it took me a while to work through the darkness and to come to a point where I can say with responsibility and not with false hope, while creating false hope, to say, yes, there is hope. There are glimmers of hope, interesting stuff happening just on the side here. This is not in my sermon that I prepared, but I encountered in my reading the strange thing that they found with coral reef research, trying to save the Great Barrier Reef that is also disappearing, where they encountered, and it was a fluke, they didn't plan on this, that they discovered that some process, and I think they're still trying to figure out what they exactly did, but some of the coral reefs where they were trying to create sort of a nursery to preserve coral species, that the growth to maturity of some of the coral species happened in 4 years instead of 35 to 40 years. So they said this is something to be optimistic about, that if they can figure out what exactly the process was that they administered to the coral reefs, there is hope to at least preserve some of the coral. I want to share with you a few thoughts, and there are many other things to do. The first one is for us as God's people at this time in this place to accept that inaction is not an option. That we have to face reality as God's people and not withdraw into a bubble of denying the precariousness of our situation. I think it is important, and I want to give credit to Krista that sent the name of a sociologist to me, Elise Boulding. She said modern society suffers from temporal exhaustion. And what she meant by that is that it is so difficult to deal with the present and the living of every day because of the complexity of our society, that after you've done that, there is no energy left in any of us to imagine the future anymore. That we are just trying to deal with the immediate, the present, and you don't have reserves left to look towards the future, and especially to think, what kind of future do you want to imagine for yourself, and especially for your children and your descendants? So let us not be absorbed in the noise around us, but let us attempt, as responsible people of God, to not suffer from this temporal exhaustion, but focus on imagining the future that we want. I also think it is important for us to elevate this conversation above the realm and the plane of party politics. This is about the existence of us as a species, and probably of most of the life forms on this planet. Let us, as God's people, and what I've tried to instill and preach for so long, let us forget the aisle, not reach across the aisle, but eliminate the aisle in this conversation that divide us, and let us take hands and say, this is important, not to practice politics in this instance. The third thing I want to suggest is that we change our thinking, and we as Westerners are especially prone to that, from focusing on rights and start focusing on obligations. And in several indigenous populations, it is still practiced and remembered and expressed that your obligation to the ones that came before you, and your obligation especially to the ones that will follow you, that is more important than your right and your rights in the present. And I think a change that we also need to do, to make, is to arrive at the place what in our thinking, what this Elise Boulding socialist also coined, the term, the 200-year present. And I know change, I think it's Mark Twain that said, change is only welcomed by a baby with a wet diaper. That's the only person that welcomes change. But I think we should work towards this kind of change or arrive at the point where we think in terms of the 200-year present that Elise Boulding speaks about, where she says, a person born 100 years ago that are still alive today, the lessons of that person's life should be incorporated in how we deal with the present. And the person being born today should be incorporated in our thinking for the next 100 years that that person potentially will live. In that way, we can think responsibly and ethically about the present, where it is not only the immediate, but that which preceded us, the lessons we can glean from that in our thinking about the future and dreaming about the future. The last thing I want to plead with you is for us to get informed, to read and to study, so that we can arrive at a consensus about what future we are dreaming for ourselves and especially for those that will come behind us, the ones that gathered around the table here, and perhaps their children as well. I want to recommend a book by a journalist. It was published recently, I don't know, a few weeks ago. David Wallace Wells. And the title of the book is The Uninhabitable Earth. The Uninhabitable Earth. Try and get that book. It's, I think, $11 on Kindle. He's a journalist, he's not a scientist, but he's taking the science and creating a story of the everyday living and what things look like and how the future could look like if we do not do the reality check. And I want to ask you the second thing. Read this letter of Jeremiah to the exiles, where Jeremiah tells God's people, remember who you are and where you came from. And in your living, be a life-giving presence. He says, in other words, as God's people, assume your responsibility to express and live God's love in the world. And let us do that as God's people as well, where Jeremiah says what Elise Boulding says, that 200-year presence. And let us as God's people live in that way, so that life may flow from our presence on this planet, so that the future of life on this planet may include our descendants. Let us commit to that. And let us take hands as God's people and unite in and around God's love and journey into a future that will not be easy, but that can, again, somewhere in the future, be beautiful. Amen.